And this is particularly important when you have technology like heat pumps or HVAC, water heating, photovoltaics. It's not enough just to deploy the technology. You actually want it to work well. Instead of replacing the pipe, which costs between $3 to $7 million a mile to replace, we're going to spend some of that money to completely electrify all the buildings on this pipe. And we're going to retire this pipe and give free appliances and electrification to all the buildings. Probably the policy, I would have to say, has been some of the easiest. This is the fastest moving part of the clean tech revolution.
Welcome back to Clean Techies, the #1 podcast for climate tech entrepreneurs. I'm Somil.
And I'm Silas. Each week, we publish the secrets to success from investors, founders, operators, and experts in climate tech around the world. Building a startup is hard. Building a climate tech startup is even harder. But we make it a little bit easier.
We put a lot of effort into these shows, so we hope you enjoy. Don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and let us know who you think we should have on next.
With that, let's get into today's episode.
Today, we're sitting down with Panama Bartholomy, the executive director and visionary founder of the Building Decarbonization Coalition. Panama's journey is anything but ordinary. From growing up on a marijuana farm in Northern California to spending 20 years decarbonizing buildings, he's become a key player in the fight against climate change. In this episode, he takes us through his unique path and how it led to the creation of the BDC and the way that they are driving change. From pushing state-level policies in places like California, New York, and Washington, to creating impactful public-private partnerships that set the standard for nationwide transformation. Panama also shares his recent experiences in China, offering a fascinating look at how the world's largest heat pump manufacturer, I had no idea, is eyeing the US market and what that means. We also break down his opinion on the incentive market around home decarbonization in the US and if it will work or not. He tells us why he's not worried about the outcome of the 2024 election in the US, and he leaves us with a few ideas on where the future climate tech is headed. If you're a free subscriber, you're only receiving the first half of this exclusive interview. So to hear the rest, go to cleantechies.substack.com and upgrade to paid to hear more from experts like Panama. Enjoy the show.
All right, Panama, welcome to the show. How are you?
Doing really well, Somel. Great to have you.
Thank you for coming on. This is like a very, very fun episode for me. I know we talked for basically a whole half hour before this, but I'm super excited.
Good. Me too. There's nothing I like talking more about than heat pumps and induction stoves. So thanks for the platform.
Well, let's get into it. Who are you?
My name is Panama Bartholomy. I'm the founder and executive director of an organization named the Building Decarbonization Coalition.
We're going to start off with our favorite question. If you could have dinner with any clean techie or climate tech OG, who would it be and why?
Yeah, it's one that I really miss. Art Rosenfeld was the OG on building science and energy efficiency. I mean, so much so that he got a Medal of Honor from President Obama for all of his work. He was, coined the term negawatt. Just an incredible man for years working at Lawrence Berkeley Labs and then eventually at the California Energy Commission. I got the opportunity at a young age of my career to work with the man, and you know how it is early in your career, you don't even know what you don't know, and I had a chance to be with an OG, and I wish I could have the opportunity again after 25 years of working in the industry just to talk to him and get his perspective and learn from him again. I miss the man.
That's incredible. It's also, I think, I don't know if you know this, but on this show, it's not often that people name people that they actually know. So that's super cool to hear your story there. Amazing. I'd love to get into a little bit of your background. So I'd love to hear your story. Please tell me your story.
Sure. So I was raised on a marijuana plantation up in Northern California, up in southern Humboldt County, basically by hippie parents, and lived through the 70s and the 80s up there as President Reagan came in and increased enforcement against it, and watched the military industrial complex come to like a really small rural community to fight over a cash crop. So my parents got out of there and moved out to Hawaii and then farther south on the coast. And I spent my whole life going back and forth between Hawaii and Northern California and just learning a lot around different ecosystems, different approaches to energy production. Spent most of my life in solar powered homes growing up. And so it was always kind of at the back of our mind that you could be doing something a little bit different than the way that mainstream culture was happening. After high school, there was really low expectations for me coming out of high school, and probably probably mostly my fault. And I spent a few years just kind of bumming around before I got into college. And finally, my family said, you got to go to college. And it was there that my life got changed. Two professors really changed my life. A environmental politics professor and then an engineering professor really opened my eyes to the challenges we're facing in the world with technology and how the combination of politics and technology can alleviate so much of the pain and suffering that we have in the world and can provide a much better future for billions of people. And so it was with that change in my life that it put me on a path of getting into government. And I graduated from college, Humboldt State University up in Arcata, California, and took what I thought was going to be a 3-month internship in Sacramento. I was going to go down there, make a bunch of great contacts, and then like go work in solar or something. But I was fascinated by the opportunity to be able to make huge amounts of change in state government, particularly California, fifth largest economy in the world, obviously a leader in climate tech, and the opportunity to work on policies that could affect, every PV system installed in the state and be able to affect transmission permitting, EVs was just too great. So I ended up spending about 15 years in state government in Sacramento, working at different agencies, but about half that time at the California Energy Commission, where I was the advisor to two chairwomen and just got to see it all. This was Gray Davis, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jerry Brown era, everything from million solar roofs to the passage of the country's first climate laws to the rise of hydrogen in the movement, renewable portfolio standards really taking off. The aughts and the teens were just a fascinating time to be in government in California. And so about 2013, I followed my wife over to Europe. I was a love pat. She got a job in Europe, and I went over there and worked on energy efficiency finance for about 4 years, traveling all over Europe, trying to find a way to standardize building energy efficiency retrofits so that they looked and acted more like an asset class that could be bundled together, dozens, hundreds, thousands of retrofits bundled together to be able to bring to the financial community so that they would be able to actually invest in building energy efficiency finally rather than sitting on the sideline for so long. So that's my background. We came back to the US in 2017, and it's right about the time that I started the Building Decarbonization Coalition.
You made my job easy for me. I'd love to talk about the BDC. So I'd love to ask, how did the Building Decarbonization Coalition come to be?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Somel. So I came back to the US in 2017 thinking this is a great opportunity for a career pivot. I'd been working in buildings and land use activities for a good 20 years. And, I probably have a good 30 or 40 more years in my career. So this is an opportunity to, go work on electric vehicles or large scale renewables or force everybody to be vegan or something like that. But I looked around when I came back and there was a whole different conversation happening on buildings. For 40 years, it had all been about energy efficiency and how do you continue to whittle down the amount of energy being consumed. And instead, there was now a conversation about how do you completely eliminate pollution from buildings. And that was just too exciting to pass up. And so you work at the Energy Commission in California, and eventually everybody that works on energy comes through there. It's like they call it Energy U because you can just meet everybody and learn everything there. And so I had a bunch of great connections. And so I just spent about a year going around with a briefcase and a PowerPoint, talking to everybody at utilities, manufacturers, local governments, design and construction firms, just like, what are you hearing on this building decarbonization thing? Like what's missing? What's working? What are you afraid of? What are you excited about? And after about 9 months, I found that most everybody was saying the same thing for about 80% of what I was hearing. They all agreed on what was needed. And the 20% was kind of some of the harder stuff, right? Like taking away choice, around things like appliances. But everything else leading up to that, folks were in agreement with. And so I started going around talking to people of, hey, do we want to come together and work on this together? There's a lot of momentum that we can create and market forces that we can create and trust that we can build between our organizations that will allow us to then work on that hard 20% because of all the momentum and the trust that we built. And so that was the genesis of the Building Decarbonization Coalition.
And what was needed at that time? And also just to anchor, what year was that?
Yeah, so that was 2018. And what we did, what was really needed was a forum. There needed to be a place. There was lots of discussions happening on building decarbonization, but it was mostly fighting about it, to be honest with you. And there wasn't agreed upon definitions and concepts and approaches. And so we needed to create a forum where we could actually get some stuff written down and some action plans agreed to that everyone could agree on. And so in September of 2018, we pulled together a meeting of 60 different organizations. And these were utilities, manufacturers of heating equipment, both water heating and space heating, the design and construction community, installers, local governments, and nonprofits, all getting together. And we spent about 5 months developing a roadmap for how to decarbonize all of California's buildings. And at the end of it, we looked around and said, this is a great plan. Do we all want to work together on implementing it? And nearly all of the organizations said, yes, let's start a coalition together to actually make this happen. And that was the start of the Building Decarbonization Coalition.
That is such a cool story.
You know that feeling when you meet someone who shares your vision for the future? It just clicks, like two peas in a pod. Well, that's exactly how we felt when we met Goodwin, who we are proud to have as our sponsor. Being the first major law firm to set up a climate-specific startup and venture practice makes them exactly the kind of partner we are excited to work with. They realize that there are a plethora of challenges to building climate tech startups, and that's why they have built an entire suite of resources for founders, investors, and entrepreneurs in the space. They even offer several tailored pricing methods. And guess what? It doesn't matter where you are listening to this. Goodwin is a global law firm that you can trust to be your partner through it all, from incorporation to exit. They've got you covered. Go to goodwinlaw.com and tell them Clean Techie sent you to get exclusive access to startup resources. All right, back to the show.
So starting as a forum, now expanding to a lot of things that, a lot of people I think in the building decarbonization world know about. What is now the grander vision and impact of the Building Decarbonization Coalition?
So it's our vision to completely eliminate pollution from buildings. And that largely comes from the burning of fossil fuels in buildings. It's mostly 4 major appliances that do this: your space heating, your water heating, your cooking, and your clothes drying. That makes up about 98% of emissions from most buildings. Colder climates, more of that is over on the space heating than on warmer climates. And so it's our goal to really create the right policy conditions so that we can create the right market conditions so that we can bring the consumer along to be able to get completely having buildings relying upon clean energy for all of their heating needs.
And so how is the BDC working to get there? What are the different verticals of operation you have?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the reality is that most of the policies and the market forces that affect the appliances that use fossil fuels in buildings happen at the state level. And so we work at state levels across the United States in 3 different verticals in order to make this happen. Number 1, transformational policy. How do you create the right market conditions so that you are lowering costs, making this work for the market, making sure that consumers are getting a good deal out of this, and setting clear timelines for the market about when we're going to have to be phasing out the sale of gas appliances eventually so that they can start to plan. So that's one vertical. The second vertical is working with the market and actually transforming the market. And this is really understanding every part of the supply chain, from the manufacturers to the distributors, the retailers, and the installers, understanding the pain that they go through in this transition from what may be a multi-generational approach to installing fossil fuel equipment to now having to switch over to clean energy equipment with heat pumps and electric cooking equipment. And so we work directly. Our membership is made up of all of the manufacturers of water heating equipment in America. 90% of the market share of space heating equipment in America are our members. And we work really closely with them to understand what they're facing, what their challenges are, so that we can incorporate that into public policies and programs, but also so that we can work with them to try to be a catalyst ourselves to bring about some of the solutions. And so an example of that is getting to like 120 volt pieces of equipment rather than 240 volt pieces of equipment. And so instead of having to do a full-on electrical upgrade to put in a hot water heater, being able to plug into a regular 110 outlet for a water heater. And then the third vertical we work in is consumer education. Everyone agrees you have to do significant levels of consumer education so that when someone's making a decision about replacing their air conditioner or their heater, they have just enough education to be able to know that they're supposed to ask for the clean energy version of the replacement rather than just getting another gas replacement in there. And so we spend a lot of time working on those three verticals and the interaction between those three verticals.
So, of the three verticals, transformational policy, transforming the market, and then consumer education, which has been the easiest to achieve and which one has been surprisingly the hardest?
Yeah, I think probably the policy, I would have to say, has been some of the easiest. It's been amazing to see how quickly I talk to people consistently that this is the fastest moving part of the clean tech revolution, buildings. This thing just started really in 2018. 2016 didn't have a lot of people talking about building decarbonization. So this is still relatively young, 6 or 7 year old movement. And you have 1 in 4 Americans living in a jurisdiction that's adopted a building decarbonization building code. You have whole states like New York and Washington and California saying all new construction shall be built with heat pumps and electric cooking equipment. And this is all before the rollout of the IRA rebates as well. The last 2 years, amazingly, because of policy, heat pumps have actually outsold gas furnaces and fossil fuel boilers across the United States in every month of the year for the first time. And so public policy has really driven this explosion of deployment of heat pumps. We're having great conversations with the market actors, but I think the part that's really lagging has been on the consumer education side.
Climate tech founders are taking on a huge challenge. Not only do they need to know how to build a startup, but they also need to deal with hardware, have a strong handle on climate policy, know how to fundraise from diverse investor types. It's a lot.
That's why we make Clean Techies, the #1 podcast for climate tech entrepreneurs. In addition to our jobs, we devote 20 hours a week to producing this podcast for you. This way you can learn from the people who have walked the path before you, learn from their mistakes, and gain insights on navigating this complex journey. If this mission resonates with you, we are asking for your help. It takes a lot of effort and it's not free.
If you are already a subscriber and want to help, start supporting us today by going to Substack and clicking Upgrade to Paid. Thanks for helping all the climate tech entrepreneurs like you.
That's really interesting. To hear you say that policy is the easiest thing was not what I was expecting. What do you think has been so powerful and I guess easy to mobilize legislation at the state level? I guess what's the nuance there that's making it, somewhat straightforward?
I think it's where we focus. One of the pieces of good news, or one of the fortuitous parts of this movement is that you have a bunch of states that are leading on climate change that collectively represent about half of the gas demand in the country and half of the appliance sales in the country. And so if you're able to move those states who have all adopted underlying climate laws already, if you're able to move them collectively in a similar direction on a similar time frame, it sends a really powerful market signal, not only to the appliance sector, but also to the natural gas sector as well. And so you can't meet your climate laws in any of the states that have adopted climate laws without buildings being a fundamental part of achievement of those laws. And so in states like New York, where upwards of 40% of all the emissions in the state are coming from buildings, you have to work on buildings. California, 25% of all the emissions coming from buildings, you have to work on buildings. And so we rely upon some of the underlying dynamics of laws that have passed and use that as a backstop for us to be able to push on buildings and building deployment.
You mentioned that a few states represent half of the demand. What are those states?
Yeah, it's basically the Northeast, the whole West Coast, the upper Midwest, and then I would throw Colorado in there. And so collectively, you have 10 states that represent half of all gas demand and half of heating appliance sales. If you throw in a few more, say you get to 13 states, a little bit more of the Northeast, you get upwards of getting around 55%. But the wonderful part of this movement is that we can really focus in on those states to be able to create a ton of market momentum. And that market momentum will create such a bifurcation in the market that it'll force federal action on having to think about a long-term wind down of gas appliance sales in the country.
Oh, wow. So it's the idea of getting enough collective state action to make it impossible for the national legislature to ignore.
Exactly. And by doing that, what we're doing is we're giving certainty to the market. One of the things we like to say in the organization is that, the supply chain is no different than the rest of us. They just need TLC. Transparency, longevity, and consistency is all the supply chain's looking from policymakers. And so if we can create the right conditions, then it'll be the market that'll be going to Washington, D.C. and demanding the transparency, longevity, and consistency from policy, not the advocacy community.
This is the year for a lot of really exciting home decarbonization startups, especially in the software space, some looking in the installer space, permitting, right? There's a bunch, especially one I think that you're very well partnered with, Eli, but there really are a lot of players out there that are sort of hitting the market now, I think, to take advantage of all of this social and public momentum. There's a theory amongst investors that there's an element of regulatory capture that some of these best players might be able to tap into. And a lot of people look to California as sort of the leader in the market. So I wonder, for you, being in the space so heavily, do you agree that it's sort of a California sets the tone and everyone kind of follows?
I think historically, for a lot of clean tech, it's been that way. And what I'm really encouraged about as well, California continues to play its leadership role and, adopting building standards and adopting far-reaching programs that support clean tech. We're seeing a lot of innovation and creativity and leadership from other states. So the state of Washington, the first state to adopt a building code that requires heat pumps for both water heating and space heating in buildings. The state of New York, the first state to pass legislation that will require all future buildings to be completely all electric. They were the first state to actually adopt a law in New York on thermal energy networks. Basically another way to take whole neighborhoods off of the gas grid and instead put them on a network geothermal system. And so we're seeing just a ton of leadership happen from other states as well. Some of the ones that I'm really excited about are Illinois and Colorado and Maryland. I think 2025, and I'll throw Minnesota in there, are going to be the year that those states potentially, dare I say, vault ahead of the Californias and the New Yorks as far as really exciting policies. And one policy I would say for the listeners to be keeping an eye out on is something called clean heat policies. It's basically renewable portfolio standards for gas utilities, looking at the overall emissions from a gas utility and requiring every year a ratcheting down of those emissions by either direct emission reductions or investments in things that'll reduce emissions, like gas utilities actually running heat pump programs to be able to get buildings off their gas network. And so we're going to see probably 5 states run with clean heat standards. That'll be a much more managed way to start to think about winding down the gas system rather than the current unmanaged kind of chaotic way that we do it. So I'm really excited about some of the action happening in those other states.
I want to take a second and use this to take a step back and look at the macro, right? The macro of the industry, not just at the state level. The state of decarbonization. In one of our conversations before this, you talked about us being at the point of transition and there being a really, really tense moment in our history right now, especially as we look to move on to a renewable energy grid. Could you tell us about that and what is really, really so important about this moment in time?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at, say, the first phase of building decarbonization movement, it's one characterized by low awareness of what this is, what the products are, how it gets done, lack of availability of the product, no programs, no policy, really low consumer awareness. And we're definitely at a very different place from all the things that I talked about earlier, the policies, the deployment. We're at a very different place. I think the explosion of interest around gas stoves and electric stoves in early 2023, what some people have dubbed Stovegate, raised significant awareness. You may think that was good or bad for the clean tech movement, but what you did have is tens of millions of Americans suddenly having the idea that perhaps a gas stove burning gas, directly flaring gas in their homes may have health consequences for family members and people. And that's the kind of sticky information that you just don't get out of your head very easily. And so that's all in the first phase of building decarbonization. And we're in a very different place right now. And it goes back to that saying about how, at first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, and then they fight you. And we're at that point right now where it's getting real. Heat pumps have outsold gas furnaces the last 2 years. And the opponents to building decarbonization, the people whose businesses and work relies upon the natural gas fossil fuel industry, are now facing this as an existential threat and are rallying their forces for this fight. And so we're getting to this new moment. And it's a new moment because we also can't ignore what are going to be some of the outcomes from the way that we do building decarbonization right now, taking an appliance by appliance approach and seeking to bolt values of climate change and equity onto an existing market model. This isn't like solar, where we're creating a new market model out of scratch. We're using the HVAC market model of the past 125 years, the plumbing market model of the past 150 years, and trying to bolt our values onto that. And so we're having to deal with a lot of unintended consequences as a result of that. And we're moving into what is really the second phase of building decarbonization, what Dr. Emily Grubert usually terms the mid-transition, this moment where you're both winding down the fossil gas system as you're trying to wind up the clean energy building electrification system, but you're doing it within a social, economic, and regulatory construct that was not designed for either one of those two realities, but definitely not designed for having them both happen at the same exact moment. And so we're at this really unique time where we have to do things, have to make plans, and have to carry out activities that we wouldn't do during a full fossil fuel reality or a fuel clean tech reality, but at this mid-transition moment. And so the next 5 to 7 years are really going to set the foundation for the next 2 decades of building decarbonization. And so we're at this really, I'd say, fun, but perhaps the most challenging point of building decarbonization. Whenever people come to me with their challenges around decarbonizing their house, I say to them, it's never going to be harder to decarbonize your house than it is right now. It's only going to get better.
That is a lot of reason to be hopeful. You clearly understand this from a sort of a systemic view, that we're transitioning from one sort of industry model and society feeling to the next. What gets you excited about that? What do you think we're doing really well?
I think what we're doing really well right now is focusing on setting some of the right policy that's leading to significant deployment. And so, but we're relying upon a lot of the old ways, 40 years of clean energy deployment to do that. And so we're looking at consumer incentive programs. We're looking at building codes. And so I think we're doing that work really well. What we need to be really thinking about, though, is what does science tell us about climate change, about the speed of deployment that we actually need to have buildings play their role in meeting our climate targets? And how do we actually do this in a way that reflects the movement's values around equity and justice? How do we make sure that we learn from electric vehicles and solar, and that some of our most vulnerable communities that have the least access to this are not the ones left on an ever more expensive gas grid? And then lastly, how do we protect ratepayers in this? We got a big transition moment here where we're going to be winding down the gas system potentially very fast. And the people that are left on that gas system are going to be left to pay off those fixed costs with higher and higher rates. And at the same time, greatly expanding demand on the electric system. And so in this moment of transition, how do we make sure that we do everything we need to do, but also protect ratepayers on both those systems so they're not bearing the brunt of this transition?
I'd love to talk about how the US has kind of built its future around decarbonization, around incentives, right? We talked about why a lot of startups and sort of technology actors are popping up to take advantage of this sort of a policy structure, but I think it also represents some concerning dynamics for the future. So I want to just kind of open up the question to you. What do you think about our incentive structure for building decarbonization in the US right now?
Yeah. So there's a lot to say here, but just a few thoughts on this. So historically, we haven't done a good job with buildings on incentive programs. They've been mostly downstream, meaning the incentives go directly to the customer, and the customer is responsible for the processing of the incentives and hoping that they'll make a purchase on the promise of an incentive, paying off some of the cost of the technology. We found that to be largely hard to get to any kind of scale on it, relying upon customers to become an expert in rebate processing. We also have found that, and over focus on pure deployment rather than performance creates perverse outcomes. This is particularly important when you have technology like heat pumps or HVAC, water heating, photovoltaics. It's not enough just to deploy the technology, you actually want it to work well. And the current market that we have for HVAC and water heating in America is one of volume. Get it in fast, get on to the next project. That doesn't always lend itself to high quality, which then begets really good customer experience and what you want, which is an advocate for heat pumps to then go and tell all their neighbors about heat pumps. And so the IRA got it partially right with the homes program, where they allowed for an energy efficiency program to rely upon what's called performance-based incentives. Actually basing an incentive based on the performance of the installation and how the installation performs over time for efficiency or energy production. And so we really need to be moving away from pure deployment to one that's more based on actual performance. But ultimately, a focus on incentives is a baby step approach to building decarbonization or clean energy deployment. And if you look at what climate science tells us at the rate of deployment that's necessary, having incentives be able to meet that rate of deployment would require such an incredibly engaged, involved, and educated consumer and contractor base that I think it's impossible to be able to expect that. And we're never going to be able to meet our targets based off of a purely incentive-based structure. So I think it's great in order to be able to get the technology out there, to be able to educate some people, to be able to pull some of the installer community into this. But we need to be quickly moving off of incentives and moving on to things that we actually know will be able to get us to what we need in order to meet our climate targets.
I think geopolitical risk is something that people don't really consider when they're talking about sort of the incentive structure in the US market. And not for lack of knowledge, but for, I think there is very much an energy of, okay, let's increase our domestic production and our domestic decarbonization. I think that led in the early clean tech days and clean tech 1.0 to what happened with solar. And I think you can speak to a really interesting dynamic that we have with China right now, looking at home decarbonization. So you were just there, spent, I think, a substantial amount of time educating people in the US landscape. But now I'd love to ask you to educate us on China. Just tell us about your trip to China and what do they think about decarbonization?
Thanks for listening so far. To get the full episode, go over to Substack and become a Clean Techies premium member by selecting any paid membership. Not only will you get access to hear the rest of this episode, but you'll get access to exclusive interviews, our monthly show, the best, most relevant insights from our shows, and access to our premium community.